Hi, I'm Jordan Patrick Finn, and you're listening to the True North Country Comics Podcast.
Welcome to the True North Country Comics Podcast, dedicated to promote Canadian comic book creators and supporters. It's February 8th, 2021. I'm John Swinimer. If you want to drop me a line, you can contact me at john@truenorthcountrycomics.com. On this episode, I chat with Jordan Patrick Finn about Death Kanji. The podcast is available on Apple Podcasts and Google Podcasts, and it's also available on the True North Country Comics channel on YouTube. Jordan is a comic writer and Lovecraft enthusiast from Ajax, Ontario. His debut graphic novel, Hellcraft, was self-published in 2018 with help from Kickstarter. His latest project is Death Kanji, a samurai horror graphic novel. With its roots in the short stories of H.P. Lovecraft and the films of Akira Kurosawa, Death Kanji tells a story of a samurai struggle to maintain his duty and honor when terrifying knowledge comes to light. The book is described as a story about how we view the unknown and our reactions to creatures and concepts that we do not fully understand. So without further ado, here's my chat with Jordan Patrick Finn about Death Kanji. So Jordan Patrick Finn, thank you very much for taking time to chat with me.
Hey, I'm honored to be here, John. Thanks for having me on.
I appreciate your time. What I normally do to start off the interview is ask the creator about their first comic book. So I'm wondering if you remember, what was the first comic book that you read?
That's a difficult question. I've listened to your show and I've heard other creators also kind of struggle with early memories, but I don't know exactly. But I remember reading X-Force, Rob Liefeld's like early X-Force, really early in my life. I was born 91, which I guess was the year that came out, so my parents probably were buying it at that point. And those were some of the earliest books that I can remember reading, along with like a bunch of old Archie books that I think my mom and my uncle had at my grandparents' house.
Cool. Good stuff. So as a writer today, I'm wondering who influences your work?
Currently who's influencing my latest work is, mostly H.P. Lovecraft. I'm influenced a lot by also film, like writer and directors, Eggers and other horror creators and stuff like that. But for Death Kanji, my latest book, definitely it's based on Lovecraft short stories, but also Akira Kurosawa's films.
Why do you think there's I notice even on Netflix now, there seems to be a real fascination with horror. Do you think that's a way to escape the realities that we're facing today? Do you think that might be it?
I don't know, to be scared of, other things instead of the very real fears that we all have. Could be. I just think horror has taken like such an upswing over the last 5, 6, or 7 years or so. Like basically the A24 horror films have just been dominating. There's this smarter breed of horror that all the like intellectual critics are calling, post horror or elevated horror or whatever. And it's just horror. It's just doing it really, really good, and it's nice to see.
There's definitely a variety out there, that's for sure. So you mentioned your latest project, Death Kanji. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about it, maybe a little bit about the story without giving too much away, and maybe talk about the origins of the project too.
Yeah, absolutely. Death Kanji it's an 80-page samurai horror graphic novel that's basically about a samurai's struggle to sort of maintain his honor and do what he perceives as his duty when he uncovers some horrifying secrets. And that sort of idea developed in my head when I was obviously reading Lovecraft's short stories, and so many of his works have this sort of storyline of uncovering family secrets, like a secret family bloodline or whatever. Oh, my grandparents were really like fish people, or some kind of hideous monster or something, and it drives the characters insane. And at this time, I was also like watching all these old Kurosawa flicks, and
okay.
So these two ideas just like smashed together in my brain, where I was like, oh well, what if that idea doesn't necessarily drive you insane right off the bat, but what do you do with that information once you've had it, and if you've had this code of honor that you have to uphold? How do those two ideas intersect with each other? What do you do when you find out there's this dark and terrible family secret? You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah. Typically, when I think of Lovecraft, I think of Victorian times. So this is a real juxtaposition to put a samurai type of setting with this story.
Yeah, absolutely. I've heard, I haven't made this claim, but I'll repeat it. I guess maybe this counts as me making the claim, but that it might be the first Lovecraft samurai comic. I certainly can't think of any others. I know there are a lot of horror samurai books out there, but not specifically Lovecraft ones that I'm aware of anyway. So maybe I'm the first, maybe not. If you know of any others, please please let me know because I would love to read them, obviously.
Sure. Well, it's definitely unique. I mean, usually I ask the creators about the research they do, and there's certainly a lot of background story. There's a lot that you've put into this to make it seem authentic. And I'm wondering if you could explain a bit what sort of research you did to create your book.
Yeah, sure. Well, the two main pieces of research obviously were, reading Lovecraft stories and watching Kurosawa flicks. But then also I felt obligated to do a ton of research into, Japanese culture and Japanese history. So I was reading all these like history books and watching old documentaries about like the samurai culture and all these things. So I kind of took that very seriously and basically before developing the story, like I wrote a initial first draft point form kind of thing of all the major plot beats, but then before I actually scripted out any sort of samurai related stuff, I spent like 2-3 months just reading all these textbooks and stuff about Japan just to get my information correct.
And the next thing I want to talk about is your collaborators. So I'm wondering if it was a bit of a challenge to find the right person who understood this particular point in history, I guess, to perfectly reflect the samurai culture and the clothing and that sort of thing. Was that a challenge for you to find the right person?
In this situation, that was not that was not really a challenge that I faced because I just worked with the artist who I have worked with previously on my last book, Hellcraft. He's a collaborator who we've worked on comics maybe 6 times in the past together. Greg Woronchak. He's also a Canadian, which I love. That was something I was specifically looking for a lot of the creative team was trying to hire Canadians in all those roles. So my artist is Canadian, and the letterer that I found, Lyndon Radchenka out of Winnipeg, also Canadian. And I tried looking around for a colorist, preferably from Canada. But as you say, you have to find someone who's the right fit for the
Mm-hmm.
project
Right.
and who can really bring the image in my head to life. And in that case, it was AHG, who is unfortunately not Canadian, but he's an extremely talented colorist. Other than that, I added a couple other creators. There were a few pages that AHG couldn't do in terms of coloring, so I hired another Canadian for that, a fellow named Chris Smith, again out of Winnipeg. And then kind of the last important creator, I shouldn't say that. There's the logo designer DC Hopkins, who's a good friend, but the last like really really kind of important person to this book was Ariella Cristantina, who did the cover, and the cover is just this beautiful watercolor piece.
Mm-hmm.
And Ariella, I found just through reading Vault comics. I think she did the covers for Fearscape. And
Okay.
basically, the day that I read Fearscape and looked at the variant cover gallery in the back of the book, I saw her watercolor pieces and just immediately got in contact with her. And I said, this is the person who has to do the cover for Death Kanji because this is like the perfect fit for what I envision this book to be. And I think she did an incredible job.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. It very much reflects the tone of what you're trying to get across. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, I thought so too. Yeah, that
Yeah.
watercolor, style is perfect for Death Kanji, I think.
Yeah. So you found most of these people, you had already worked with them before, but do you use any type of method for finding collaborators that works for you? Do you look through DeviantArt or on Twitter or Instagram? What method works for you that's best?
I have done those. What worked for me actually when I first worked with Greg years ago was I found him on zwall.org forums, and I don't know how I found that website. Like I don't know where zwall originated from, but I just like years ago was Googling like trying to find comic creators. I know now there's probably Facebook groups and subreddits,
Mm.
and I'm sure there were at that point as well. But what I found was zwall.org/forums, I think at the time. I don't know if that link is still active or still exists, but that helped me a lot. I found a couple artists that I've worked with on there actually.
Oh, cool. You mentioned just briefly another book that you worked on called Hellcraft. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that.
Absolutely. Hellcraft was my first real comic that I worked with Greg Woronchak, the artist, and that was another Lovecraft idea. I'm becoming such a one-note writer. I can't wait to write something that's not Lovecraftian, but that was basically a detective horror comic that's light on the horror but more fun and pulpy and sort of an adventure book about this detective like coming across these Lovecraftian monsters. And it's a 4-issue collected book that I have 100 pages, 4 issues, and it's each issue is basically a take on a different Lovecraftian story, but not directly adapting it, more like adapting around it.
Okay.
For example, one of them is the Statement of Randolph Carter, which is this famous story of Lovecraft's where the story is about a guy and his friend who go out, grave robbing, I guess. They dig up this ancient tomb and the guy runs down into it and never returns. And basically the narrator who stays above ground hears, oh, your friend is dead, basically, down in the tomb. Like a monster speaks to him over the radio. And so my idea for the issue of Hellcraft based on that story is, well, what happens after that? What happens to that guy? He gets arrested, and then do they go and investigate? That was just a jumping off point. So I don't directly adapt the Lovecraft stories, but I adapt sort of adjacent to them.
Okay. Yeah, where can people buy your books, Hellcraft and Death Kanji?
Well, right now with my extremely low demand, I prefer to sell, face to face. I'm available in a couple stores because this is a Canadian podcast. It's worth mentioning there are a couple stores in Canada. Page and Panel has Hellcraft, which is a Toronto store for listeners. And then Comic Book Addiction in Whitby and Worlds Collide in Oshawa, because that's sort of my area, Durham region in Ontario. But mostly I just sell my books online, just creator to buyer, usually on Twitter at Jordan P. Finn. But I mean, people could just send me an email at jordanpatrickfinn@live.ca, and I'm happy to sell, personally to people instead of there being a storefront between us, because I do like to hear people's feedback to my books. Like I want to know what people thought, even when it's not exactly the best. Like I like to hear criticism as well as praise. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. I mean, that's a thing we've been missing, with this pandemic, is the actual events that we typically go to, and you get to interact with readers and creators. And I'm hopeful we'll get back to that. But I just heard that TCAF is now going to be virtual this May, and we're hopeful that things will turn around by the end of this calendar year. But fingers crossed, we'll get there eventually.
We're not doing so great on vaccinations right now, I think, but one day I do try to do that actually every so often, maybe once a month or every second month. Just hold like a fake little table in my house with my camera set up and live stream on Twitter. So I try to interact with people in that way, because as you say, like that's something that we deeply miss in these times.
We'll get back to it, that's for sure. So we've talked about Death Kanji and Hellcraft. I'm wondering what's next for you. What's your next big project?
I don't have anything ready to announce or reveal at this point, but I basically Death Konji was kickstarted over the summer last year, and I've just finished up like getting it finally produced and shipped out to everyone. And during that whole process, I refused to work on a next book. Basically, I didn't want to sideline Death Konji in my brain and work on a different comic. So I refused to let myself think about that until basically last week when I've got this book out and finished and done. And now I'm ready to move on. And I have ideas for a project, but nothing set in stone right now.
You mentioned social media before, where people can find you. Where else can maybe you could just list all the different places where people can find out more about your future work when you do have plans to make that public?
Absolutely. The best place for me is on Twitter at Jordan P. Finn, but I'm also there on Instagram at Jordan Patrick Finn, and those would be my two main ones. If you look up Jordan Patrick Finn on social medias, that's usually my tag on there. It was a little too long for Twitter. It had to be Jordan P. Finn.
Thanks to Jordan for the chat. You can discover more about Jordan on Twitter at Jordan P. Finn and on Instagram at Jordan Patrick Finn. And thanks to you for listening to the True North Country Comics podcast. If you haven't done so already, please subscribe to and like this podcast on Apple Podcasts. And please leave a good rating. Also check out the TrueNorthCountryComics.com website and follow along on Twitter at TrueNorthComics. True North Country Comics is now on YouTube. Please like and subscribe to that video channel. And please send your feedback to John at TrueNorthCountryComics.com. Thanks again for listening, and come back soon for another episode. Bye for now. True North Country Comics Podcast is copyright True North Country Comics, copyright 2021.